Story 1. Danny Lloyd, who played the child in The Shining, was my biology professor in community college. He was a great, very kind professor and did not like talking about his childhood acting. Story 2. The other lead kid from Weird Science, the one who is not Anthony Michael Hall, was my medieval literature professor in college. Story 3. When I was a store manager at GameStop, I hired a guy from my hometown who was a former National Football League player. He had retired due to injury and was never a big name. He floated around the league, playing for 4 teams in 6 seasons. He did not need the money. He had been smart with investments and savings. Our hometown is rural and poor. He just wanted to get out of his house and do something. He was a huge gamer and a great employee who never asked for special treatment. I still talk to him now and then, although we have not worked together in almost 15 years. Story 4. Back when it was a sweet little bar with great gumbo, Great Jones Cafe in New York City was my favorite spot to grab a bite, have a beer, and listen to the jukebox. The bartender, Mark Ibold, was always good for an interesting chat. After years of this, one day he said he was going to be out of town on tour with his band. "What is your band called?" "Sonic Youth." For the record, Mark Ibold, better known as the bassist for Pavement, toured with Sonic Youth in the 2000s. Story 5. My small, leafy, mid-Michigan liberal arts college had degree requirements. I postponed the arts requirement until my senior year and took Introduction to Theater. The professor turned out to be Jeff Daniels, who lived a half-hour away in Chelsea. His career was in a lull in the early 2000s and he was growing bored. Story 6. I roomed in college with the man who was the voice of Charlie Brown for many years. He now works for the Department of Public Works in a small town. Story 7. The original drummer for The Offspring, James Lelia, was my wife's gynecological oncologist. He did everything he could, and for that I will forever be thankful. Thank you all for the condolences and kind words. It means a lot. When she was diagnosed, she was 31 and I was 36, and we had a 1-year-old. Less than 2 years later, when our son was 3, she passed despite everything imaginable. Dr. Lelia performed the biopsy and then removed the tumor from her cervix. She then underwent radiation and chemotherapy, but unfortunately the damage was done. The cancer was incredibly aggressive, and while not guaranteed, there would have been a much higher chance of survival had it been found earlier. So take a minute to remind the women in your life to schedule a pap smear, also called a pap test. I know it is a difficult thing to bring up, but early detection is everything. Thanks for reading. I hope this helps someone. Story 8. One of the creators of the Oregon Trail fixed our cable connection at our house in the late 1990s. Story 9. I used to work in emergency medical services in New York City. There was a former Jersey Shore cast member who briefly worked there. The keyboardist for Typo Negative is a phenomenal paramedic working in central Brooklyn. He is a really cool, laid-back person. He had the highest tolerance for hot peppers I have ever seen. Story 10. My 4th grade teacher was the bassist for Joan Jett. When Joan Jett was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he was there. It was strange to see him on television. Story 11. The child who played Charlie Bucket in the original Willy Wonka film is a veterinarian in Lowville, New York, an extremely small town in the United States of America. He is tired of talking about it. Story 12. I met a former guitarist for the band Boston. He now works in search engine optimization. Story 13. Jeanette Goldstein, who played Vasquez in Aliens and John Connor's adopted mother in Terminator 2, opened a bra store for plus-sized women called Jeanette Bras. She says the alphabet starts at D. I performed in a play with her in 2004. She is great. If you have a larger-than-average bust and live in Los Angeles, visit Jeanette Bras. Story 14. The actor who played Ogre in Revenge of the Nerds worked at a bar near me. Story 15. The owner of a local bike shop won an Olympic gold medal in cycling and still repairs and sells bicycles. Story 16. A man at the phone store was putting a screen protector on my cell phone for me. His technique was immaculate, no bubbles. "Damn, you're pretty good at that," I said. "Thanks, man. I get a lot of practice goofing around with them on the job." "Ah, sounds like a pretty cool job." "Yeah, but it's nothing compared to my last job. Oh, really? What was that? I played for the San Diego Chargers. Story 17. Randy White, a former Dallas Cowboys legend, lives in the town I grew up in. We used to run into him all over town, getting supplies for his farm, putting diesel in his truck, and checking his mail. Growing up, I always knew him as one of the greats, and it never stopped being awesome to see him around, just living life and saying hello. Story 18. Roger Stevens, the lead guitarist of Blind Melon during the 1990s and later a member of several smaller bands after the group broke up following Shannon Hoon's death, is now a practicing attorney in Philadelphia. Story 19. Former Olympic gold medal swimmer Beth Botsford used to bartend next door to my condo. She was a genuinely nice person. Story 20. Lauren Tews, Julie from the Love Boat, worked the fancy cheese section at the Capitol Hill and Broadway Quality Food Center store in Seattle when I lived there. She was very pleasant. To be clear, I used to live in Seattle, not in the cheese section. Story 21. When I lived in Los Angeles, I took yoga classes taught by the actress who played Libby on Lost and the actress who played Scarlett, who slapped Johnny Depp in the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Story 22. My friend Kyra played Karen Cooper, the little girl in the basement in the original Night of the Living Dead. She became an art teacher for many years and now works the horror convention circuit. She is a phenomenal artist and a wonderful person who rescues hard-to-home animals. I love her dearly. Story 23. Maureen Mo Tucker, the innovative drummer for the Velvet Underground, was working at Walmart when I met her in the 1970s in Douglas, a small rural town in South Georgia. She had left music to raise her children. I was a fan. She seemed like an ordinary person. She later returned to music. Story 24. My husband knew Bob Breyer from My Chemical Romance. He used to play in bands with him before the band became famous. Legend has it that after he left the band, he became a real estate agent and later passed away. On another note, I am a washed-up local celebrity who never made it to the next level, and my 34th birthday is tomorrow. This thread has given me a very positive new perspective on life after fame that is bringing me a lot of peace. You always hear about people falling apart and going insane, and I do not want to end up like that. Story 25. A former Blind Melon bassist led the sexual harassment training at my previous employer. He is an attorney now. Story 26. In the 1990s, Darius Rucker painted my grandmother's television room. Story 27. Greg Louganis lives in my hometown now. His job, apparently, is to remind people who he is. Story 28. My chemistry lab partner in college was Olympic skiing medalist Hillary Lind, who had retired. She always came prepared and knew what she was doing. Unlike me. She was very kind and helped me a lot. Story 29. My chemistry professor was in a punk band in the 1980s that was self-sufficient for several years. He was a cool guy and made chemistry interesting and fun to learn. I think I still have one of the band shirts he gave us. Story 30. I went to school with Jake Lloyd, the child actor who played Anakin Skywalker. I'm not sure what he does now. Last I heard, he moved to the Carolinas and was having some mental health issues. People like to talk badly about him, but he was always kind to me. I think it was mostly just petty high school bullying. Story 31. I worked at a call center with a very talented Ultimate Fighting Championship fighter. He bought his mother and his child's mother a house and a car. A couple of times he began having nosebleeds at his desk, like a spigot. Story 32. A former San Diego Charger defensive end became our high school vice principal. He was very personable despite his massive, physically intimidating size. I will always be grateful to him. He stopped a couple of incidents in which I was being bullied by 2 specific students. After the vice principal stepped in, I only saw one of them on campus once, and he did not even make eye contact with me. I do not know what was said or what happened, but the 2 of them basically disappeared. Thank you, Mr. Faison, and rest in peace. Story 33. The guitarist from 7 Mary 3 is a bartender at a little Irish pub in Boston. He is a cool dude and loves the jukebox playing Cumbersome 15 times in a row. Story 34. I work with a famous National Football League kicker who was an All-American in college and led his team to the Super Bowl. That team and season have enormous local legendary status and are still referenced in popular culture. He is an industrial sales engineer for a chemical company, very friendly and skilled at his job. He could likely have retired years ago, but he continues working because he enjoys it and the pay is good. He is a genuinely nice person. Story 35. Bob Denver, who played Gilligan on Gilligan's Island, was the legal guardian of his niece with special needs, and my mother was her caseworker. This is not exactly the question the original poster asked, but it is close. He was retired at that time and living a normal life. He was a great advocate and clearly loved her, unlike many of my mother's other clients. I do not remember it, but apparently he held me as a toddler while my mother met with him. I was behaving like a typical toddler. His niece was a lovely woman and she played with me a lot. I remember her. Story 36. I worked in a restaurant in the late 1970s with Peter Tork. Story 37. My guitar teacher was the drummer from Social Distortion. Story 38. I met the original drummer of the band Oleander. He was homeless and living out of his car in a small Northern California town. He assured me that if he fell asleep, it was definitely not because of heroin. He then promptly nodded off. Story 39. He was the semi-obscure lead singer of the punk band All, formed by members of the legendary punk band The Descendants. I recognized him from the Descendants documentary when I saw him working as a bartender. Story 40. Dan Spitz, the former lead guitarist of the thrash metal band Anthrax, retired from music to pursue a career in luxury watchmaking after studying at a Swiss watchmaking school. He is now known for his expertise in crafting high-end timepieces and has been featured in documentaries about his work. Story 41. Back in the early days of the National Football League, players didn't get paid much and some worked second jobs in the off-season. I had the Steelers' Pro Bowl defensive end L.C. Greenwood as a substitute boys gym teacher in 4th grade. We ended up sitting in a circle just doing a question and answer session for the whole class. I was in awe. Story 42. The drummer of Gwar was my boss once. His stage name is Jismak Degusha, but I knew him as Brad Roberts. He and his wife own a flower shop in Richmond, Virginia, and I was their delivery driver for a summer. Gwar remains active, though this was the summer after Dave Brockie died, which was part of why I was hired. Brad needed to focus on running the Gwar BQ Festival, a summer outdoor barbecue music festival, and had less help because everyone was grieving, so he could not deal with deliveries and van maintenance. Living in Richmond, Virginia, you could meet several somewhat famous musicians, to be honest. I met Lamb of God, Municipal Waste, Gwar, and a few random members of other bands out of context, like at cookouts and weddings. Story 43. If anyone remembers Anya from America's Next Top Model, I met her at P. Chang's on Oahu several years ago. She was our waitress. When we mustered the courage to ask if she was Anya, she said yes, took a picture with us, and was incredibly kind. Story 44. I was at a teacher training when another teacher looked very familiar. I thought we had attended before, then realized he was the lead singer of Deep Blue Something, a band I loved. He now teaches English and coaches soccer at a private school, but he still makes music. He was very nice. We hung out for the rest of the workshop, and I still see the band whenever I can. Story 45. Not long after Mean Girls aired, the actor who played Kevin G was one of the actors in The Village on my class field trip to Pioneer Village in Toronto. If you live here, you know what I am talking about. Laughing out loud. He was acting as an old-fashioned lawyer, and when they asked if we had any questions, we asked, "Are you Kevin G?" He said yes, and we all screamed. Story 46. He was not well known by name, but he was a National Football League player who became a police officer. He had a short career but has a Super Bowl ring. Story 47. Jimmy McNichol is an actor and the brother of Christy McNichol. He now owns a computer repair shop in town. Story 48. One of the members of the boy band All For One was a service advisor at the Mercedes dealership where I was employed. He was the nicest, most humble person, and he had a Grammy Award on his mantle at home. Story 49. I met Gary Coleman in the early 1990s when he opened an arcade in Los Angeles called the Gary Coleman Game Parlor. It did not last long. He was selling photocopied headshots for $3, which he would then autograph. I saw a pile on a side table, grabbed one, and had him sign it. He wore a three-piece suit and would occasionally stop to play the games. One game required him to jump up and down while playing to see everything, which I thought was odd. He could have used a step stool. Their motto was games are easier so you can play longer. The downside was that all games cost 50 cents, back when most video games cost a quarter. Story 50. I met Gabby Glazer, the bass player for Luscious Jackson, when she was bartending in Brooklyn. Story 51. I once came across the Iron Sheik, megaphone raised, sitting outside a downtown Toronto shawarma joint and loudly imploring passersby to embrace goat meat. Story 52. I am not very famous, but I worked with a trim carpenter for a couple of years before we ended up at his shop to build some curved custom pieces for a house we were working on. I looked at the wall and saw plywood cutouts that looked like halves of Prince's cymbal and cloud-shaped guitars. I asked, "Andy, what are those?" He replied, "What do you think they are?" That is how I found out Andy built 34 guitars for Prince. Story 53. My cousin used to be in the soap opera One Life to Live. She is retired now but worked in accounting in the entertainment industry after she finished acting. Story 54. My former dentist appeared on the Andy Griffith Show as Arnold, Opie's best friend, and also in an episode of Star Trek, the original series. He was the best dentist in the world. Story 55. I worked with Josie Scott, formerly of Saliva, at a mental health agency. Story 56. Not surprisingly, many are Olympians. Most of those sports are not financially lucrative. Story 57. This is not my story, but my friend moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting. She worked at a restaurant in the city when Zach Woods, known for playing Gabe on The Office, came in to pick up an Uber Eats order. He was doing the delivery. Story 58. The keyboard player from Lips Incorporated, known for the song Funky Town, fitted me for contact lenses. He had a gold record on the wall and was delighted to talk about it. Story 59. I once saw Tommy Lee Jones working at a post office. I do not remember what he did before that. Story 60. I went to college and took a basic level statistics course with two of the three members of the All-American Rejects. This was shortly after they became famous for the song Dirty Little Secret. I think they knew that one member was headed down a drug-filled path and were looking for a backup plan. Story 61. Many years ago we met Erin from the Waltons, who was working as a hostess in a restaurant in San Francisco. Story 62. Deborah Yall of Romeo Void worked at the Comedy Driving School in San Francisco's South of Market neighborhood with my then-girlfriend in the early 1990s. She was a great person and fun to go drinking with. Story 63. Elon Mitchell-Smith, who played Wyatt in Weird Science, was my English professor at the university. Story 64. I don't know how famous he was, but I worked at a place that hired Olympic gold medalist Alexei Gruel. He was an office worker. I'm not sure exactly what he did, but we spoke now and then. As far as I know, he was no longer involved in cycling. Story 65. My girlfriend worked at a large law firm in Philadelphia. One of the new attorneys was Roger Stevens of Blind Melon. I met him. He was a nice, energetic, hardworking attorney who does high-end employment law work. Story 66. In my previous role, I worked in healthcare workforce development on a federally funded grant in Washington state. My boss and I were contacted by Seattle Children's Hospital because they wanted to bring a project to Eastern Washington and thought we would be well positioned to coordinate it or write grants. They sent a representative, a very pleasant man named Reuben Mays, who bought us coffee and treats and chatted with us for about 3 hours because he was so amiable and knowledgeable. The next day my boss came in surprised because when she told her husband about the meeting he asked whether it was the Reuben Mays. Apparently he is a Washington State University Cougar legend who also played in the National Football League. He now works in regional partnership and philanthropy for Seattle Children's Hospital. Story 67. For 2 years I had no idea that an administrator at my kids' school had won the reality show Survivor. Story 68. While working, I suddenly heard a noise and looked up to find Robert Hughes, the art critic of Time magazine, staring at me in disbelief. "But you're Philip Glass. What are you doing here?" It was obvious I was installing his dishwasher, and I told him I would soon be finished. "But you are an artist," he protested. I explained that I was an artist but sometimes a plumber as well, and I asked him to go away and let me finish. Story 69. I went to the Astor Diner in Greenwich Village with a few friends in 1989. We whispered about our waitress whenever she walked away, and we finally figured it out. When she returned with our drinks, we all gushed that she had played Trini on 321 Contact on the public broadcasting service when we were kids. She said she was always surprised to be recognized and was still auditioning, hoping for her big break. We left a stellar tip. Story 70. I knew Michelle Trachtenberg as a regular kid. We went to elementary school together. Story 71. MC Hammer moved to my hometown in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He used to come into the Chevron where I worked. He was nice. One day he came in wearing his own t-shirt, so I called him out on it. As a result, he had to bring me one, and he did. Another time he arrived with two other men, and they performed new material, rapping in the parking lot for about 15 minutes. It was a mini MC Hammer concert. He was very cool. Story 72. I'm almost certain I met the actor Ben Foster about 20 years ago, while I was working at a small shop in Boston near Harvard Square. I did not recognize him at first, but he was very nice and I had a feeling I knew him, though I did not know why. He said he worked there seasonally for friends who ran the shop. As I was walking away, I suddenly realized who he was, but I did not go back. He is originally from Boston, which fits. He went on to do major roles after that, so it seems likely. Story 73. I met Susan Powder working a drink window at a shop in Taos around 2011. She had an exercise and nutrition program in the 1990s called Stop the Insanity and was somewhat prominent on daytime television. Lovely woman, sad story. Story 74. Mike Morton is a Super Bowl winning football player who is now a dentist. Story 75. One of my former managers has a Super Bowl ring and was featured in a video game with his team. He was down to earth, positive, and upbeat. He was one of the best bosses I have had. Story 76. This might only be recognized by Canadians. I bought a Roots sweater from the actress who played Busy on Ready or Not. Story 77. My neighbor had a long-term recurring role on All My Children as Brian Bodine, Kelly Ripa's television boyfriend. He still acts. He played Lyle, the pawn shop owner on Cobra Kai, and also does a lot of gig work. He has worked as an Amazon driver, Lyft driver, healthcare exchange broker, and in sales, doing whatever he needs to do between acting gigs. He has twins in high school and a daughter in college. Story 78. How about Ally Sheedy? She is a college professor and book editor now. Story 79. It was a long time ago in Los Angeles, but I met Gary Coleman working as a security guard. Story 80. I saw Frankie Muniz perform as a drummer in a semi-reggae band in college and talked to him afterward at the bar. He is about 5 feet 6 inches tall and tried to steal my jacket. Story 81. I've only met local performers who never hit it big, but it's wild seeing someone who once had a few 100,000 followers now just living like everyone else. It shows how unpredictable life is. Story 82. At my job, I work at the same company as a former National Football League player who was not a superstar but was well known. He works in an office, is good at his job, is laid back, and is funny. There is also a somewhat famous college football player who participated in the National Football League Combine but was not drafted. He is very fit and good-looking, but a bit strange. He still works for the company, though I am not sure what his role is. A senior woman in the office was a member of the Olympic track team. I have a cousin who is a talented guitarist, lyricist, and producer. His old band toured nationally as an opening act, headlined a few shows, received some radio play, and signed a record contract. The singer, who legally owned the band's copyrighted material, name, and business, broke up the band about a week after they were signed, so they had to return the advance, much of which had already been spent. The singer died a few months later from a drug overdose believed to be related to a binge on 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine. Now my cousin is an aircraft mechanic who records in his home studio and occasionally releases material with a collective he belongs to. Story 83. Adrian Dantley is a name that will not mean much to anyone who was not a National Basketball Association fan from the mid-1970s through the 1980s. Suffice it to say, he was a prominent figure in that sports community. Wikipedia says, Dantley worked as a referee for high school and recreational league games in the Washington, D.C. area. In 2013, it was reported that Dantley also worked as a crossing guard at Eastern Middle School in Silver Spring, Maryland. Dantley was quoted as saying he got bored sitting around the house and took the job to help school children safely cross the street. It was big local news when the crossing guard story broke. I had seen him refereeing in public before that and wondered, is that Adrian Dantley? Story 84. Piggy from Road Rules was a cashier at my Blockbuster when I was in high school. That sentence really dates everyone in it, including me. Story 85. Betty Page was in her 60s. She worked at a small home-turned breakfast diner in Whittier. It might have been hers. It had the best breakfast menu in the area. This was the late 1980s. Story 86. Jeremy Jeldwax, the drummer for the first season of the Partridge Family, worked for me at Shell Offshore in New Orleans in the late 1980s. He supported our Macintosh network. He did not tell anyone who he was, and we only learned after he left the company. He was a contractor and his contract was terminated, effectively letting him go. I went home and told my wife that I had just fired the drummer from the Partridge Family. She actually had the Partridge Family Christmas album, and lo and behold, there he was on the album. We did not really believe the story until the album confirmed it. This was before the internet. Story 87. While in Washington, D.C., my friends introduced me to their buddy who worked as a bouncer at a strip club. We later became friends. When I first met him, we were joking around and he made fun of the huge necklace I was wearing, and I responded that he should talk, given the gaudy ring on his finger. Turned out to be a Super Bowl ring, and he let me try it on, laughing out loud. Story 88. I was a regular and frequently interacted with Dylan Sprouse when he worked at Mud Cafe in the East Village in New York City. He was chill. Story 89. Randy Robinson used to be a big wrestler in the 1980s and now works at the deli counter in my local supermarket. Story 90. I worked at the Ford assembly plant with a former National Football League player, Tony Hoskins, but never met him. One day, a forklift driver who had wrecked a load of engines by driving recklessly was being escorted to a hearing with a union representative and a supervisor. He was ranting as they walked, and Tony stopped to ask what was going on. The worker said, "Who the fuck are you and what can you do about it?" Tony said, "I'll show you." It was one of the few times the union could not help a man keep his job. Story 91. One of my neighbors is a professional musician, a rock drummer who plays in a local band that tours occasionally. He was in a well-known British folk rock band and has been a session musician and producer since the 1970s. He is very down to earth and does not talk about his work. He is one of the nicest people you could meet. His collaboration list reads like a who is who of British rock. The highlights, in my opinion, are Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Elton John, and Jimmy Page. That is just the tip of the iceberg, and I wish I knew him better because I bet he can spin a great yarn. His wife is one of the loveliest women I have ever met. They are an adorable English couple living in an anonymous suburb in the United States. Story 92. Mr. Fuji, a professional wrestler and actor, was the ticket stub attendant at the movie theater in the mall where we grew up. Story 93. Fred Savage from the Wonder Years authenticates luxury watches in Dayton, Ohio. Story 94. My neighbor was in a 1980s Canadian hair band. They were one-hit wonders, but I cannot remember the name of the band or the song. Every few years, some of his celebrity friends come over and jam in his garage until the early hours of the morning. Nobody complains because he and his wife are the nicest people. Debbie Harry and her driver once stopped and asked another neighbor for directions. He and his wife came over after my dad died and shoveled our driveway. I am a big fan. Story 95. Bill Jolly, former bassist of the Butthole Surfers, Was opposing counsel in a legal case I handled in 1996. Story 96. My dad was a television anchor in the 1980s and my grandpa laid tile. He sometimes helped and got recognized. People would say, "Hey, didn't I see you on television last night?" I always laugh at that. Story 97. Eric Heiden, who won 5 speed skating gold medals at the 1980 Olympic Games, is an orthopedic surgeon. He was, for a time, the team physician for the Sacramento Kings. Story 98. Kurt Vonnegut's son was my pediatrician when I was little. Apparently he is an author too, but not as famous as his father. I don't know if this counts, since he wasn't a household name. Story 99. Kelly McGillis once waited on me at a restaurant in Key West. Story 100. He was not famous. Ordinary people would not recognize him. Spot, who was the producer and engineer for SST Records in the 1980s and who produced many classic West Coast punk and hardcore albums, used to tend bar and bus tables at Lovejoy's in Austin until they closed around 2008. On Friday nights, he played the mandolin. Story 101. You are probably too young to remember him, but I got to know Arthur Brown, the god of hellfire, when he worked as a house painter in Austin. I even set his head on fire one Halloween. Look him up. Story 102. I used to work at a Southern California manufacturing company with Dawn Lynn, the actress who played Dodie on My Three Sons. She was a real sweetheart. Story 103. Bobby Pizziferrato of the band Wild Cherry, known for the song Play That Funky Music, was our neighbor and very cool. He let us use his lawnmower and we'd whacker. He even cut the grass for us a few times. Story 104. The kid from My Girl and the Sandlot owns a pizza place outside Tampa. He is the one who says, "You're killing me, Smalls." Story 105. Johnny Chow, the bassist from Stone Sour, is a bartender in Buffalo, New York. He owned a restaurant called Ms. Yuta Chow's that unfortunately closed recently. He is a very nice person. Story 106. The craziest example is former Olympian Susie Favor Hamilton, who worked as an escort in Las Vegas. I am not sure whether that counts as a regular job. Story 107. My wife and I were buying our first home in the 1990s. We met with a loan officer and, after a few minutes, I figured out he was a former National Football League player. Story 108. Gary Coleman worked as a cashier at Caboose Hobbies in Denver in the early 1990s when he was broke. My brother was into model trains then, and Gary cashed us out a couple of times. I distinctly remember him sitting on a bar stool to operate the register and how he was always excited to talk to customers about the trains they were buying. Story 109. My stepbrother jumped through the wedding cake in the November Rain music video. If you try to look up the man's identity, it has been a big rock and roll mystery for years. There is a recent video blog interviewing a man who is not credible. The closest account was a Vice article in which someone said they met him while backpacking through Southeast Asia years ago and told the whole story. Details check out. The witness remembered the name is Slow, but it is actually Slow. He is an international flight attendant and plays bass in a cover band at pubs. Story 110. My dentist was the bassist in a 1980s metal band that had brief success in the progressive and power metal scene. He includes it in his biography on his website, Laughing Out Loud. He is a really good dentist, so I am not doxing him. Story 111. Creed Bratton used to play guitar in the band The Grassroots. He now works at a mid-sized paper company in the Northeast. Story 112. The drummer from the Stranglers used to host the pub quiz at a place I worked. He would get very angry if anyone mentioned Golden Brown. Story 113. Not exactly, but sort of. My father-in-law was a National Football League player and ran a limo company that transported people such as John Wayne, Lucille Ball, and Theodore Seuss. He welded the nose cones on several Apollo rockets and taught Bruce Willis to fly fish. I thought he was the world's biggest liar until I realized he wasn't. He is now deceased. Story 114. When I worked at Guitar Center about 15 years ago, they hired a new sales guy named Jason, a grunt like me. Turned out he was the original bassist for Weezer. He was not really famous, but he still knew those guys. Just a small world moment, I guess. Story 115. This was in 1984. I was visiting a friend at her place of business and met someone who worked as a paste-up layout artist for my friend, who had a business in Los Angeles that created silkscreen t-shirts. I went to the workshop to visit and was introduced to Susan, the paste-up layout artist. I told her she seemed familiar, and she explained that she had been a child actress and had played Cindy Brady on The Brady Bunch. Story 116. Darkman X worked at the Waffle House in Greer until he died. Story 117. I was blowing glass as a guest at a Renaissance fair in 2003 or 2004, when a trio of musicians stopped near our booth to play a song. They put a hat on the ground to collect money. They began to play, and I went over to put some glass beads I had made into the hat, probably about $20 worth. One man smiled, but his face fell when he realized they were beads and not cash. It was Henry Thomas, known for the film Z.T., The Extraterrestrial, Gangs of New York, and Suicide Kings. He seemed genuinely to be expecting cash in that hat. I felt terrible. Story 118. Before he moved, my uncle was a regular at an Italian restaurant called Scotty's and met the owner several times. The owner was the lead singer of a band called Slam Bamboo in the late 1980s. They were not huge, but they were popular locally and seemed about to hit it big. The keyboardist left to start his own band, and the drummer followed. Slam Bamboo fell apart, and 9 Inch Nails was born. Story 119. I cannot remember his name, but I once interviewed a comic book writer who had a run on Superman and his own title. He was an ass. He came in as if he were God's gift to programmers and then took a personal call during the interview. When he finished, I told him we were done and that he would not be getting the job. Story 120. Why are so many of you afraid to name drop and describe a person without saying their name? Story 121. He is a former World Wrestling Entertainment wrestler. He is a great guy, but he squandered every dollar he earned and now lives in a rundown house in the middle of nowhere. He has some funny stories about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Story 122. Byron Braggs was an outstanding Green Bay Packers linebacker who won the Super Bowl and received other awards. He was one of the kindest people. He worked in law enforcement and volunteered as a firefighter. He was soft-spoken, polite, strong, and always eager to teach others. It was an honor to have crossed paths with him. I will always respect him. Story 123. This guy I knock around with sometimes is always off with his band somewhere. I asked him recently what sort of stuff they play and he showed me some videos. It is Mudhoney. Story 124. My cousin-in-law was a relief pitcher for 6 seasons in the American League. After an injury forced him to retire, he coached and managed at the AA and AAA levels and in the Puerto Rican Winter League for about 20 years, with a lot of travel. He now coaches high school baseball, somewhat amusingly for my high school's rivals. Story 125. A friend told me that Kim Thale, the guitarist for Soundgarden, managed a coffee and bagel shop in Seattle before the band's reunion. Story 126. I worked at a bookshop. One of our seasonal hires was Jamie Lee from Dairy Girls. Brought on when the show's first season aired, she was pleasant to work with. Story 127. Ja Wobble drove a tube train for a while. When I left Public Image Limited, I stopped doing sulfate and cocaine, but 3 years later, on tour in America, I started taking drugs again as well as drinking heavily, and by 1986 I was in big trouble. I stopped. I am 28 years clean and sober, and I started working on the underground in 1987. One day I got on the tannoy and started shouting into it. I used to be someone. I had that calling to get back into music. Story 128. A former porn star worked at the grocery store in my town. She checked me out at the register once and said thank you. I almost replied with her porn name. Story 129. I was a night manager at Walmart and had a former National Football League cornerback as a frozen food stocker 15 years ago. Story 130. I remember seeing a comment on Reddit about someone getting an Uber in Toronto. The driver was Spinner from Degrassi and was mildly famous. Story 131. Debs OG, also known as Farrah's mother from the original Teen Mom series, now works for the Transportation Security Administration at the Omaha Airport. Story 132. John Waters star and independent actress Mink Stole drove for Uber in Baltimore for a while. She really startled my friend when she pulled up. Story 133. Peter Wingfield, who played Methos on the Highlander television series, is now a pediatric anesthesiologist in Orange County. Story 134. I can't say she had a regular job at all, but I once had a one-hour-long sit-down chat with Jane Fonda at the Planned Parenthood where I worked. We just hung out and discussed abortion and women's rights. She is a brilliant woman, and it was a true honor to talk with her. Story 135. My biology teacher was one of the twins from The Shining. Story 136. I briefly knew the actor who played Robin Williams' teenage son in What Dreams May Come. He worked for my dad for a while. He was a nice guy. Story 137. I bought marijuana once from a former Aussie Idol contestant who later had a one-hit wonder. He was working in a warehouse and dealing on the side. This was about 5 years after he had been on the show. Story 138. Benny McCrary was one of the McGuire twins, professional wrestlers in the 1970s who were notable as the world's fattest twins. After his heyday, he owned a pawn shop in my hometown that I frequented with my stepfather. I remember him being very nice and always happy to share stories. Story 139. I once worked with a man who modeled underwear for Calvin Klein. The day we found out, every meeting began with us searching for him on the conference room screen. Fortunately, the novelty wore off before he walked in on us. Story 140. I worked briefly at a car dealership with a man who played for the Oakland Raiders. He scored the winning touchdown that no one saw in the Heidi game. Story 141. My 6th grade math teacher, a former Mr. United States of America, was openly passionate about the television show Survivor and served as an alternate for season 4. In high school, another teacher was a former Mr. Universe. Danny Tamborelli from Pete and Pete All That and Figure It Out has a reggae and ska band and does work involving boats in a town near mine. When I worked at Starbucks, he was one of my regular customers. Story 142. Emmanuel Lewis rides the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority to work. He is generally grumpy and flips out if someone calls him Webster. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.